What if a human being could live an entire life that looks perfectly coherent from the outside, and still never actually make a single real choice? Not a dramatic choice. Not a moral dilemma. Just the basic act of owning a decision. Because in the world of Pride and Prejudice, there exists a man who forces us to confront that possibility. Mr. Collins is not interesting because of what he does, but because of what he never does. And here's the unsettling question. If every decision you make is already shaped before you recognize it as a decision, are you still the one choosing? That's the cognitive gap. In Regency England, status is not just identity, it is infrastructure. Marriage, profession, even self-worth operate inside a system where approval doesn't come from within, but from alignment with expectation. A system where the correct path is already drawn long before the individual arrives at the fork in the road. And within that structure, Mr. Collins is not an anomaly. He is a function. A memory fragment appears here like a quiet symbol of this system, a letter of recommendation, carefully worded, stamped with authority, deciding a life trajectory before the person reading it can even question it. In this world, documents think faster than humans. So what is Mr. Collins' real role? Not a man of ambition. Not a man of rebellion. But something more unsettling, a man who never reaches the psychological stage where rebellion becomes possible. Contradiction emerges immediately, because from the outside, he appears to be constantly making decisions. He proposes. He relocates. He aligns himself with power. Yet every action carries the same invisible signature. This was already decided elsewhere. And that is where the discomfort begins. Because we tend to believe choice is about options. But here, choice is only the final illusion in a chain of invisible conditioning. Social expectation shapes desire. Desire shapes behavior. Behavior then gets mislabeled as free will. Scale shifts quietly here, from one individual to an entire civilization. Because if one man can live without true agency and still function perfectly in society, then the system itself may not require agency at all. It may only require compliance that feels like choice. And the consequence is not chaos, it is the opposite. Stability. Predictability. A world where nothing breaks because nothing is ever truly decided. But then a deeper tension appears. If a life is fully predictable, fully compliant, fully correct, what part of it can still be called human? Here is the unsettling insight that begins to surface. The most dangerous form of control is not force. It is design so seamless that resistance never becomes imaginable. A life so well scripted that deviation feels unnecessary rather than impossible. Mr. Collins becomes a memory fragment of this idea, a symbolic artifact of a life where autonomy is not taken away, but quietly rendered irrelevant. And yet the question refuses to settle. If a person never experiences a real fork in the road, if every path is already socially validated before it is emotionally felt, then what exactly is making the decision? Is it the individual? Or is it the system speaking through them so fluently that they believe it is their own voice? And if that is true, then the more important question is not about Mr. Collins at all. It is about the invisible architecture that makes a life like his not only possible, but perfectly normal. But the deeper question is this: if a life is shaped so precisely by its environment that every decision is already anticipated, where exactly does the human being begin? Because in the world surrounding Pride and Prejudice, the system does not operate like a visible authority. It behaves more like atmosphere, unseen, unavoidable, and internalized. And that is where Mr. Collins becomes more than a character. He becomes a behavioral outcome. So the real question is not what he chooses, but whether the concept of choice was ever structurally available to him in the first place. To understand this, you have to zoom out. In this society, identity is not formed through self-discovery. It is formed through social calibration. Every signal, occupation, marriage proposal, tone of speech, is adjusted to match what the system rewards. And here is the first contradiction: people believe they are adapting to society, but in reality, they are being shaped by the act of adaptation itself. A memory fragment surfaces here, a formal invitation, accepted not out of desire, but out of obligation so normalized that refusal feels socially illegible. The document does not command, it simply defines what is reasonable. This is where the illusion strengthens. Because Mr. Collins appears active. He moves through decisions. He expresses intention. He even believes in his own reasoning. But every step is pre-filtered through what is socially survivable. Not what is true, not what is desired, only what is acceptable. And that creates a subtle but powerful shift in scale. We are no longer analyzing a man. We are analyzing a system that produces men like him. And here is the escalation. If a system consistently produces individuals who never experience true rupture between desire and action, then agency is not eliminated, it is pre-neutralized. Contradiction deepens. The more stable the system appears, the less visible personal autonomy becomes. Stability, in this sense, is not a sign of balance. It is a sign of successful prediction. Now the revelation begins to sharpen. Freedom does not disappear in such a world. It is absorbed into structure so seamlessly that resistance never forms as an option. The mind does not reject the system, it learns to think entirely within it. And this is why Mr. Collins is unsettling. Not because he is trapped, but because he does not register the existence of a trap. A second memory fragment appears, a carefully chosen phrase in a social exchange, not meant to persuade but to align, language used not to express thought, but to confirm belonging. Communication becomes synchronization. So the consequence expands beyond the individual. If enough lives are shaped this way, society no longer needs explicit control. It only needs repetition of acceptable pathways until deviation feels emotionally unintelligible. And at that point, the idea of making a choice becomes almost ceremonial. A performance of autonomy rather than autonomy itself. But then a deeper contradiction emerges. If every decision is shaped before it is consciously felt, what part of consciousness is still making the decision? Is Mr. Collins acting, or is he being acted through by a structure so complete it no longer needs enforcement? And if that is true, then the most uncomfortable realization is not about him. It is about how many lives might function under the same invisible architecture, fully operational, fully rational, and yet never once stepping outside the boundaries of what was already decided for them. Which leads to a final unfolding mystery. If agency can be absorbed so completely that it feels identical to choice, how would anyone ever know they were not free in the first place? The most unsettling shift is not when a person loses freedom, but when they never develop the internal structure to recognize what freedom would even feel like. And this is where the system surrounding Pride and Prejudice begins to reveal its deeper architecture, not as a story of individuals, but as a production line of predictable consciousness. At the center of this architecture sits Mr. Collins, not as an exception, but as a demonstration. So the question changes. We are no longer asking whether he makes choices. We are asking what kind of mind would consider every available option already pre-approved. Because here is the crisis point. If every perceived decision is filtered through what is socially acceptable before it even reaches awareness, then the mind does not experience restriction. It experiences alignment. And alignment feels identical to truth. A memory fragment surfaces again, a carefully structured proposal, not driven by emotional discovery, but by procedural certainty. The language is not passionate, not uncertain, not exploratory. It is optimized, efficient, approved. This is where contradiction begins to fracture the surface. Because from the inside, everything feels rational. But from the outside, everything feels predetermined. Scale shift becomes unavoidable here. What looks like one man's personality begins to resemble a system-wide compression of human variability. A narrowing funnel where individuality is gradually filtered into socially legible patterns. And the terrifying part is not the control itself. It is the absence of resistance. Because resistance requires a comparison point. A sense that something else is possible. But in this structure, possibility itself is pre-shaped. Even imagination is socially trained. So Mr. Collins is not struggling against the cage. He is operating within a reality where cages are not perceived as cages. Contradiction intensifies. He appears proactive, even motivated. He pursues position, recognition, and approval. But every pursuit follows a predictable gravitational pull toward what already carries legitimacy. Nothing originates from rupture. Everything originates from permission. A second memory fragment emerges, a social exchange where tone, posture, and wording are adjusted not to express self, but to maintain compatibility with expectation. Not deception. Calibration. Identity becomes an interface. And here the escalation deepens. If identity is continuously calibrated to external expectation, then over time, the boundary between what I want and what I am allowed to want dissolves completely. At that point, agency does not disappear. It becomes indistinguishable from conformity. And that is the crisis. Because a system that achieves this level of internalization no longer needs enforcement. It only needs repetition. Every interaction reinforces the same invisible structure until deviation feels not dangerous, but unnecessary. Now the revelation begins to fracture open, but not fully. What we are witnessing is not a man deprived of choice. It is a mind in which choice has been pre-solved before awareness begins. But then the consequence becomes more disturbing when viewed at scale. If one life can be fully stabilized in this way, then what prevents entire generations from inheriting the same invisible framework, mistaking predictability for maturity, and compliance for wisdom? And now the greater question emerges, darker than before. If a human being can function perfectly within a world where every desire is already shaped before it is felt, what part of that human being can still be considered original? And if nothing inside the system originates freely anymore, then what exactly is generating the illusion of freedom that everyone continues to believe in? The most critical realization is not that a system can shape behavior, but that it can shape the very definition of what a decision is supposed to feel like inside the mind. So the question becomes sharper now. If every internal preference is already filtered before it becomes conscious thought, then what exactly is left that could ever interrupt the pattern? And this is where the revelation finally begins to surface. Within the world of Pride and Prejudice, agency is not removed by force. It is redefined as alignment with social legibility. What a person is allowed to want slowly replaces what a person actually wants, until the distinction no longer produces emotional friction. This is the mechanism that produces Mr. Collins. Not as a personality, but as a fully functional outcome of a system where desire is always post-processed through expectation. Here is the deeper revelation. He is not someone who lacks individuality. He is someone in whom individuality has been continuously translated into acceptable forms until nothing untranslatable remains. A memory fragment emerges like a quiet structural artifact, a written recommendation, not simply granting permission, but quietly defining what is reasonable ambition for a life before that life ever articulates its own direction. The document does not command behavior. It compresses possibility. And now the insight becomes unavoidable. If every expression of self is only validated after it passes through a social filter, then the mind stops generating raw intention. It starts generating optimized intention. An optimized intention always resembles conformity, because conformity is what the system rewards. This is not suppression. This is convergence. And once convergence stabilizes, contradiction disappears from experience entirely. Not because it is resolved, but because it is never generated in the first place. Scales shift now becomes total. What appears as one man's life pattern becomes a template for an entire civilization, a society where people no longer experience the tension between desire and action, because desire itself has been shaped to match permissible action from the beginning. A second memory fragment surfaces, a social interaction where approval is not explicitly given, but implicitly embedded in tone, expectation, and timing, making deviation feel not rebellious, but simply incoherent. The system does not reject alternatives. It makes them unthinkable. And this leads to a deeper consequence. In such a structure, freedom is not taken away. It is simulated at the exact moment consciousness begins to reflect on it. The mind believes it is choosing because it experiences selection, but the space of selection has already been pre-compressed. So Mr. Collins is not a man making false choices. He is a man living inside a space where only one category of choice ever survives long enough to feel real. And now the revelation sharpens into something more uncomfortable. If the architecture of a society can consistently shape not only behavior but the internal logic of desire itself, then individuality is not erased, it is standardized. And what is standardized begins to feel natural. Which raises the consequence to a civilizational level. A world like this does not produce oppression that can be easily identified. It produces coherence so complete that resistance lacks conceptual language. Everything functions. Everything makes sense. Nothing breaks. And yet something essential never forms. So the greater question emerges, no longer about a single character, but about the structure that makes such lives indistinguishable from ordinary existence. If a human being can be perfectly integrated into a system that shapes even their most private sense of desire, then what remains that could ever tell them they are not the author of their own life? Then the real question is no longer about whether a person has free will, but about what kind of system could make free will unnecessary for survival inside it. Because at this point, the structure surrounding Pride and Prejudice stops behaving like a social environment and starts behaving like a selection engine for behavior itself. And within that engine, Mr. Collins is not an outlier. He is the clearest expression of how the system resolves human uncertainty. Here is the core revelation: the system does not eliminate choice. It eliminates the need to generate original choice in the first place. That is the hidden mechanism. What looks like a life filled with decisions is actually a life where decisions are continuously pre-shaped into socially optimal outcomes before consciousness ever experiences them as conflict. The mind never reaches the stage where it must choose between competing truths, because the competing truths are filtered out long before they become emotionally real. A memory fragment surfaces, a polite social exchange where agreement is not earned through reasoning, but inherited through context. The words feel like choice, but they behave like recognition of what was already structurally approved. And once this mechanism stabilizes, something subtle but irreversible happens. Desire stops being generated from within and begins to be assembled from external validation patterns. People do not ask what they want. They ask what would make their wanting acceptable. That is the transformation. And this is why Mr. Collins matters at a deeper level than personality. His role is not to represent stupidity or obedience. His role is to reveal what a fully integrated social being looks like when internal desire has been completely synchronized with external permission. Influence in this system does not come from force. It comes from definition. Whoever defines what is reasonable defines what is possible. Contradiction collapses here in a very specific way. The more aligned a person becomes with their environment, the less distinguishable their internal voice becomes from the system's voice. Not because it is replaced, but because it is refined until it no longer produces friction. Another memory fragment appears, a written endorsement that does not persuade, but stabilizes identity, quietly confirming what the individual is already allowed to be. It is not instruction. It is boundary design. Now the insight expands. In such a structure, freedom does not disappear through restriction. It disappears through overintegration. When every internal impulse is already matched to a socially acceptable pathway, there is no remaining space where conflict can form, and without conflict, there is no perception of choice. Scale shift becomes unavoidable. This is no longer about one character or even one society. It becomes a model of how civilizations maintain coherence. Not by suppressing individuals, but by designing environments where deviation never becomes psychologically necessary. And the consequence is profound. A perfectly functional society can produce individuals who are entirely stable, entirely rational, and entirely disconnected from the experience of authorship over their own lives. Everything works. Nothing breaks. And yet something fundamental is missing. The moment where a human being recognizes that they are the origin point of their own direction. And this leads into a deeper philosophical fracture. If a system can fully synchronize internal desire with external approval, then the concept of self becomes less like an author and more like an interface, an output layer translating structure into behavior. So the question is no longer whether Mr. Collins is free. The question becomes whether freedom requires visible resistance at all, or whether a system can erase the conditions that make resistance imaginable in the first place. The most lasting impact of a system is never measured by what it destroys, but by what it makes people stop noticing as something that could ever be different. At this stage in the world of Pride and Prejudice, the structure is no longer visible as structure. It has already dissolved into expectation, into habit, into what feels normal to live inside. And within that normalization, Mr. Collins stops being an individual case entirely. He becomes a long-term output of a system that no longer needs to justify itself. Here is the consequence at its deepest layer. When agency is continuously replaced by socially validated pathways, people do not feel controlled, they feel correct. And correctness is more stable than obedience. Because obedience still implies an awareness of force. But correctness removes the need for awareness altogether. A memory fragment emerges again, now carrying a heavier weight, a formal interaction where agreement is not chosen, but anticipated. So precisely that disagreement never forms into language. The exchange feels natural, even peaceful, but its most important feature is invisibility. Nothing feels imposed because nothing feels alternative. This is the true expansion of the system. Not suppression of choice, but the disappearance of the psychological architecture required to recognize choice as a distinct experience. And from here, the legacy begins to take shape. Mr. Collins is not remembered as a man who failed to think independently. He is remembered, symbolically, as what happens when thinking is perfectly aligned with external validation loops. His legacy is not personal failure. It is systemic predictability achieved through internal consent. Scale shift becomes global in implication. Because a society that can produce such alignment at scale no longer depends on authority figures or explicit rules. It depends on cultural momentum so consistent that deviation feels emotionally unanchored. People do not avoid rebellion because they are afraid. They avoid it because it does not register as a coherent option. Another memory fragment appears, a written endorsement that does not persuade or command, but quietly defines what is reasonable ambition for a life before ambition itself is consciously formed. The document does not shape action directly, it shapes the horizon of imagination. And that is where the true consequence deepens. When imagination itself is structured, the future becomes not something discovered, but something selected from pre-existing templates. Lives diverge only within permitted ranges, creating the illusion of uniqueness while preserving systemic uniformity. This is why the system remains stable even without visible enforcement. It is not maintained by pressure. It is maintained by alignment between identity and expectation until they become indistinguishable. Legacy, therefore, is not just what remains after Mr. Collins. It is what continues to reproduce him without needing his presence at all. And the unsettling part is this: nothing about this system appears broken from the inside. In fact, its greatest strength is that it produces lives that feel coherent enough to never question their coherence. So the final reflection emerges with increasing weight. If a civilization can continuously generate individuals whose internal sense of direction never conflicts with external validation, then what disappears is not freedom itself, but the possibility of noticing its absence. And that leads into the final unresolved tension. If a life feels fully correct from beginning to end, with no visible fracture between desire and approval, what kind of truth would be required to prove that anything was ever missing at all? In the end, the most unsettling realization is not about a single character, and not even about a single society, but about how quietly a system can redefine what it means to live a life that feels fully your own. Within Pride and Prejudice, the world does not end in rupture. It ends in normalization. A settling of contradictions into something that feels stable enough to stop questioning. And in that stabilized world, Mr. Collins remains not as a warning of excess, but as a reflection of completion. A life that has fully absorbed its environment until nothing inside it needs to resist anything outside it. The final insight is this: when a system is successful enough, it does not need to remove choice. It only needs to make every available choice feel equally reasonable, equally approved, equally safe. At that point, decision itself stops being an act of separation between paths, and becomes a ritual of confirmation. A memory fragment returns here one last time, a quiet, formal exchange where approval is not spoken as authority, but embedded so deeply in tone and expectation that disagreement no longer forms as a coherent emotional possibility. Nothing is forced. Everything simply aligns before it is ever questioned. And this is where the legacy of Mr. Collins becomes fully visible. Not as a man who lacked depth, but as a symbolic endpoint of a deeper process. A life in which internal direction and external expectation have become so synchronized that the idea of divergence no longer has emotional weight. He does not stand outside the system. He proves how completely a person can be contained within it while still feeling functional, appropriate, even successful. The human meaning of this is not about history or literature. It is about recognition. Because the most stable form of influence is not the one that tells you what to do. It is the one that quietly shapes what you are able to imagine yourself wanting in the first place. At that point, identity is no longer a confrontation between self and world. It becomes a translation layer where the world speaks so fluently through the self that no difference can be detected between them. And yet, something remains unresolved beneath that coherence. If a life can feel entirely correct from the inside, with no visible fracture between desire, action, and approval, then correctness itself stops being evidence of truth. It becomes evidence of successful alignment. So the philosophical reflection narrows into something more uncomfortable and more precise. Perhaps the question was never whether people in such a world are free or not. Perhaps the real question is whether freedom requires contradiction to exist at all, or whether a system can become so seamless that even the absence of freedom no longer has a shape that can be recognized. And if that is possible, then the final silence left behind is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of a question that never fully disappears.